The morning sun cast golden rays across the sprawling Abuja mansion as 20-year-old Amaka carefully arranged fresh hibiscus flowers in the crystal vase her late mother had treasured. Her stepmother, Grace, watched from the marble staircase with eyes that seemed to calculate every movement, every breath Amaka took. "Make sure those flowers are perfect, dear." Grace's voice dripped with false sweetness. "The Adebayo family will be here for dinner tonight, and we must maintain our reputation." Amaka's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the red blooms. It had been 4 years since her father's sudden death from what doctors called a heart attack, though Amaka had always wondered about the timing. Just weeks before his death, Chief Okoro had mentioned wanted changes to give Amaka more control over the family's pharmaceutical empire when she turned 21. Now that milestone was only 8 months away. Grace descended the stairs with the fluid grace of a predator, her designer dress flowing like liquid silk. To the outside world, she was the perfect widow, devoted to her late husband's memory and caring for his daughter with maternal love. But behind closed doors, Amaka saw the calculating gleam in those dark eyes. The way Grace's smile never quite reached them when they were alone. "Your father will be so proud of how you've grown," Grace continued, her manicured hand briefly touching Amaka's shoulder. The touch felt cold despite the warmth of the morning. "Though I do worry about you taking on too much responsibility too quickly. The pharmaceutical business is complex, dangerous even. Perhaps it would be better if you focused on finding a suitable husband instead." The words hit their intended mark. Amaka had spent the last 4 years learning every aspect of their pharmaceutical operations, from research and development to distribution networks across West Africa. She knew the business better than anyone except Grace, who had systematically positioned herself as the indispensable manager during Chief Okoro's final months. "I'm ready, Grace," Amaka replied quietly. "Father trained me for this. I know I can handle the responsibility." Grace's laugh was musical and chilling. "Sweet child, running a pharmaceutical empire isn't like organizing charity galas or managing household staff. There are dangerous people in this business. Competitors who destroy us without hesitation, government officials who must be carefully managed, suppliers who could cut off our raw materials on a whim. A young woman like you could make one wrong decision and bring down everything your father built." As Grace spoke, Amaka noticed how naturally the woman referred to the business as something to be protected from her, rather than something being prepared for her inheritance. It was a subtle but significant shift in language that had been happening more frequently as Amaka's 21st birthday approached. That evening, during dinner with the Adebayo family, Amaka watched helplessly as Grace painted a picture of a sweet but naive young woman who needed guidance and protection. Dr. Adebayo's son, Kemi, was being positioned as both a potential business partner and suitor, someone who could provide the strong male leadership that Grace suggested the company needed. "Amaka is still so young," Grace said with maternal concern, her hand resting possessively on the documents that contained the latest quarterly reports. "She has wonderful ideas, but lacks the experience to navigate our industry's complexities. Perhaps a partnership with your family's medical supply company could provide the stability and guidance she needs." The conversation continued around Amaka as if she weren't there, decisions about her future and her inheritance being discussed by others. When she tried to interject with her own thoughts about potential pharmaceutical research partnerships with international companies, Grace gently redirected the conversation back to more appropriate topics for a young woman. After the guests left, Amaka confronted Grace in her father's old study, surrounded by medical journals and business awards that represented decades of hard work building their pharmaceutical empire. "Why are you trying to push me out of my own inheritance?" Amaka demanded, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "Father left everything to me because he trusted me to continue his work." Grace's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the maternal facade. "Your father left you a responsibility you're not equipped to handle. This industry has wolves who would devour an inexperienced girl without hesitation. I'm trying to protect you from making mistakes that could destroy everything." "What kind of mistakes?" Amaka pressed. "I've been learning this business since I was 16. I know our suppliers, our research projects, our distribution networks. What could I possibly do wrong that you couldn't guide me through?" "Guidance only works when someone is willing to listen," Grace replied sharply. Your father spoiled you, made you think you could handle anything. But this business requires tough decisions, compromises that might shock your idealistic sensibilities. Some of our most profitable contracts require flexibility and regulatory compliance. Some of our research shortcuts have saved lives by getting medications to market faster. A naive girl might report these efficiencies to authorities who wouldn't understand their necessity. The word sent chills down Amaka's spine. Her father had built their pharmaceutical company on integrity and innovation, always insisting that patient safety came before profits. What Grace was describing sounded like the kind of corruption that had destroyed other pharmaceutical companies in Nigeria. Father would never compromise patient safety for profits, Amaka said firmly. That's not how he built this company. Grace's smile was sharp as a blade. Your father was an idealist who died before he could see how the industry really works. I've been protecting his legacy by making the hard choices he couldn't make. But you're too much like him, too pure, too principled. You destroyed everything within a year. That night, Amaka lay awake reviewing financial documents she had secretly copied from Grace's office. What she found made her blood run cold. Their pharmaceutical company was involved in importing substandard medications from overseas suppliers, bypassing safety inspections through bribed officials, and conducting unauthorized drug trials in rural communities without proper consent protocols. Worse still, she found evidence that Grace had been systematically transferring company assets to offshore accounts, apparently preparing to disappear with a family fortune before Amaka could take control. The woman who had raised her for 4 years was not just stealing her inheritance. She was destroying her father's legacy while putting countless lives at risk with dangerous medications. As dawn broke over Abuja, Amaka made a decision that would change everything. She would gather enough evidence to expose Grace's crimes and take back control of her father's company before more people were hurt. But she had no idea that Grace had been watching her every move, calculating how to eliminate the one obstacle standing between her and complete control of a pharmaceutical empire worth hundreds of millions. The trap was already being set, and Amaka was walking directly into it. What do you think Grace is planning to do to Amaka? This stepmother schemes run deeper than anyone imagined. Drop your predictions in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because next chapter will reveal just how far Grace is willing to go to protect her secrets. You won't believe what happens next. The next morning brought an unexpected invitation that should have been Amaka's first warning. Grace suggested they take a drive to visit the new pharmaceutical distribution center in Jos, a 3-hour journey that would give them time to discuss Amaka's future role in the company. The suggestion came with Grace's brightest smile and an enthusiastic description of how the facility represented the future of their business expansion. I want you to see how far we've come since your father's passing, Grace explained as they prepared for the journey. This new facility will triple our distribution capacity across northern Nigeria. It's the kind of achievement that proves how well the company is being managed. Amaka agreed, hoping the trip will provide an opportunity to understand more about Grace's operations and perhaps find additional evidence of the financial irregularities she had discovered. She packed her laptop and several files, planning to use the travel time to review more documents while Grace drove. The Mercedes-Benz glided smoothly along the Abuja-Jos highway as Grace chatted animatedly about expansion plans, new pharmaceutical partnerships, and the bright future ahead for their company. But Amaka noticed subtle inconsistencies in Grace's stories. Mentions of suppliers she didn't recognize, references to distribution networks that didn't appear in any official company records, and casual comments about government contracts that seemed to bypass normal procurement processes. Grace, Amaka said carefully, I've been reviewing our quarterly reports, and I noticed some discrepancies in the overseas supplier payments. Some of these companies don't seem to have proper manufacturing certifications. Grace's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel, but her voice remained steady. International pharmaceutical sourcing is complex, dear. Sometimes we have to work with emerging suppliers to access medications that aren't available through traditional channels. It's all perfectly legal, just requires more creative documentation. Creative documentation? Amaka pressed. What does that mean exactly? It means navigating regulatory bureaucracy that often prevents life-saving medications from reaching people who need them, Grace replied with a hint of irritation. Your father was too rigid about these things. He let his principles get in the way of practical solutions. As they approached the plateau region around Jos, Grace suddenly pulled off the main highway onto a smaller road that led toward the sheer hills. She claimed there was a shorter route to the distribution center that would save them time, but Amaka didn't remember any pharmaceutical facilities being located in this rural area. The landscape became increasingly isolated as they drove deeper into the hills. Rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation replaced the cultivated farmland they had been passing, and the road grew narrower and more winding. When Amaka questioned the route, Grace assured her they were taking a scenic shortcut that would give them a better view of the region they would be serving. But Amaka's unease grew when Grace pulled over at a scenic overlook high above a river valley. The drop was nearly 100 meters to the rushing water below, and there were no guardrails or safety barriers along the cliff edge. Grace suggested they get out to appreciate the view and discuss Amaka's future role in the company. Standing near the precipice, with the wind whipping across the exposed hilltop, Amaka felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. Grace positioned herself slightly behind Amaka, ostensibly to point out landmarks in the valley below, but her proximity felt threatening rather than companionable. This is where your father and I used to come when we needed to make difficult decisions, Grace said, her voice taking on an ominous quality. He would stand right where you're standing now and contemplate the consequences of various choices. I don't remember father ever mentioning this place, Amaka replied, taking a step back from the edge. There are many things your father never told you, Grace continued, moving to block Amaka's retreat toward the car. Things about the pharmaceutical business, about the compromises necessary for success, about the people who pose threats to our operations. The word sent alarm bells ringing in Amaka's mind. She realized that Grace had deliberately brought her to this isolated location, far from any witnesses or help. The distribution center visit had been a lie, a pretext to get her alone in a place where an accident could easily be staged. Grace, I think we should head back, Amaka said, trying to keep her voice steady. We can discuss business matters when we return to Abuja. But Grace's mask was finally slipping completely. The maternal warmth that had defined their relationship for 4 years was replaced by cold calculation and barely contained fury. Your father made a mistake leaving everything to you, Grace said bluntly. He thought blood was more important than competence, that genetic connection mattered more than proven ability. But I've spent 4 years learning this business, building relationships, making the hard decisions he was too weak to make. Grace, what are you saying? Amaka asked, though she was beginning to understand exactly what her stepmother was saying. I'm saying that tomorrow, the newspapers will report a tragic accident. A young woman, distraught over the pressures of inheriting her father's pharmaceutical empire, took her own life by jumping from these cliffs. Her grieving stepmother will have no choice but to continue managing the company, ensuring that her father's legacy survives this terrible tragedy. The truth hit Amaka like a physical blow. Grace hadn't just been stealing from the company or cutting corners on drug safety. She had been planning murder from the very beginning. The woman who had braided her hair and helped her with homework was prepared to kill her for money and power. You're insane, Amaka whispered, backing toward the cliff edge as Grace advanced. People will know this wasn't suicide. They'll investigate. Will they? Grace asked with chilling confidence. A young woman overwhelmed by responsibility, showing signs of depression and anxiety, finally succumbs to pressure, especially when her loving stepmother provides evidence of recent erratic behavior and concerning statements about not wanting to live up to her father's expectations. As Grace reached into her purse and withdrew something metallic, Amaka realized that her stepmother had been planning this moment for months, possibly years. Every kind gesture, every supportive word, every maternal embrace had been calculated moves in a deadly game. The struggle that followed was brief but desperate. Grace was older and heavier, but Amaka was younger and more agile. As they grappled near the cliff edge, Amaka felt her footing give way on the loose rocks and crumbling soil. The last thing she saw before falling was Grace's face, twisted with satisfaction and relief, watching from above as another obstacle to her ambitions disappeared into the rushing waters far below. But Grace had made one crucial mistake in her planning. She had underestimated the survival instincts of a young woman who had grown up swimming in Nigeria's rivers and learning to navigate treacherous waters. The girl who fell from the Sheer Hills cliffs was afraid and unprepared, but she was far from helpless. Grace thinks she's won, but has she just made the biggest mistake of her life? What do you think happens when you try to kill someone who refuses to die? Smash that like button if this twist shocked you, and subscribe because the next chapter will show you exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate a survivor. The transformation is about to begin. The icy waters of the Plateau River should have been Amaka's grave, but instead they became her salvation. The current carried her broken body downstream for nearly 5 kilometers before depositing her, barely breathing, on a sandbank where a group of local fishermen found her at dawn. They later said she looked like a ghost rising from the water, which, in many ways, she was. Joseph Musa, an elderly Barham fisherman, and his wife Sarah pulled the unconscious young woman from the river and carried her to their modest compound in a village outside Jos. For 3 weeks, as newspaper headlines proclaimed the tragic suicide of pharmaceutical heiress Amaka Okoro, the woman who would later call herself Zara fought for her life in a stranger's home. When she finally regained consciousness, her first instinct was to reveal her identity and seek help returning to Abuja. But Sarah Musa, who had lost her own daughter in a car accident years earlier, looked at this broken young woman with maternal protectiveness and asked a simple question that changed everything. "Child, what were you running from that made death seem like a better choice?" The question forced Amaka to confront a harsh reality. If she returned to Abuja as herself, Grace would simply try to kill her again, and next time, she might succeed. Her stepmother now controlled the pharmaceutical empire completely, had legal authority over all family assets, and had already demonstrated a willingness to commit murder. Returning as Amaka Okoro would be signing her own death warrant. Instead, she made a decision that would define the next decade of her life. She told the Musa family that she couldn't remember her past, that the river had washed away her memories along with her old life. They called her Zara, meaning Golden One, hoping the name would bring her luck in this new existence. For the first year, Zara lived simply with the fishing family, helping Sarah with household duties and learning traditional skills she had never needed in her privileged upbringing. But every night, she read newspapers and business journals, tracking Grace's management of the pharmaceutical company with growing horror. Grace had wasted no time consolidating power after Amaka's death. Within 6 months, she had sold off the research division that had been developing affordable medications for rural communities, citing financial pressures and market realities. She had also entered into exclusive distribution agreements with overseas suppliers whose medications were cheaper but of questionable quality. Most damning of all, Zara discovered through careful research that 3 people had died in Kano after taking contaminated antibiotics traced back to one of Grace's new suppliers. The incident had been quietly settled out of court, with families receiving small payments in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. As her second year in exile began, Zara started developing a plan that would take 8 more years to fully implement. She began with education, using fake documents obtained through contacts in the fishing community to enroll in evening classes at the University of Jos. She studied business administration, pharmaceutical sciences, and most importantly, corporate law and forensic accounting. During the day, she worked various jobs to support herself and build a new identity. She served as a translator for NGOs working with rural communities, managed supply chains for small businesses, and eventually started her own consulting firm helping local entrepreneurs navigate government bureaucracy. Each role taught her skills that would prove invaluable in her eventual confrontation with Grace. By her 4th year away from Abuja, Zara had accumulated enough money and credentials to begin the more sophisticated aspects of her plan. She hired a private investigator to track Grace's activities and was shocked by what she discovered. Her stepmother had not only continued expanding the pharmaceutical company's corrupt practices, but had also remarried a wealthy Lagos businessman named David Adelik, whose own pharmaceutical interests created obvious conflicts with his new wife's business. The marriage revealed Grace's pattern more clearly. She was a serial widow who used marriage as a weapon to access and eventually inherit wealth from successful men. David Adelik's health had been declining since their wedding. despite his relatively young age and previously robust constitution. Medical records obtained through Zara's investigator suggested symptoms consistent with slow poisoning. This discovery transformed Zara's mission from personal revenge to a broader crusade for justice. She was no longer just seeking to reclaim her inheritance. She was trying to prevent additional murders while exposing a predator who had spent decades perfecting her deadly craft. For the next 3 years, Zara built an intricate network of evidence and allies. She connected with families of Grace's previous victims, documented patterns of financial fraud across multiple companies, and established relationships with investigative journalists who specialized in corporate corruption. She also began building her own pharmaceutical consulting business, deliberately targeting contracts that would bring her into contact with Grace's operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become everything Grace claimed she could never be, a sophisticated business operator capable of navigating complex regulatory environments and building profitable partnerships across multiple African countries. The pampered heiress who had fallen from the sheer hills had died in those waters. The woman who emerged was harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. In her 8th year of exile, Zara made her first direct move against Grace. Using shell companies and intermediaries, she began acquiring shares in the pharmaceutical company that had once been her birthright. The purchases were small and scattered, designed to avoid triggering disclosure requirements, but they gave her access to internal financial reports that confirmed her worst suspicions. Grace had been systematically looting the company's assets while expanding its involvement in illegal drug trafficking. What had once been a respected pharmaceutical manufacturer was now a front for smuggling operations that brought counterfeit medications into Nigeria while shipping legitimate drugs to overseas markets where they commanded higher prices. The human cost of these operations was staggering. Zara's investigation revealed that hundreds of Nigerians had died or suffered serious complications from counterfeit medications distributed through Grace's networks. Children with malaria had received fake antimalarials that provided no protection. HIV patients had unknowingly taken counterfeit antiretrovirals that accelerated their disease progression. Diabetics had injected insulin substitutes that caused dangerous blood sugar fluctuations. Each death represented not just a life lost, but family destroyed. Zara met with dozens of these families during her investigation, documenting their stories and building legal cases that would eventually bring Grace to justice. But she also understood that traditional legal channels moved too slowly and were too easily corrupted by the same systems that had allowed Grace to operate with impunity for so long. As her 10th year of exile approached, Zara began preparing for the final phase of her plan. She had built a successful business, gathered damaging evidence, and established a network of allies that included former government officials, investigative journalists, and international law enforcement agencies. But she also had something Grace could never understand or anticipate. She had found peace and purpose in her new life that went far beyond mere revenge. The broken girl who had fallen into the river had been motivated by hurt and anger. The woman preparing to return to Abuja was driven by a deeper mission, ensuring that no other family would suffer what hers had endured, and that no other victims would disappear into rivers or fall from cliffs to satisfy one woman's endless greed. On a humid morning exactly 10 years after her supposed death, Zara packed a single briefcase with 10 years of evidence and boarded a bus to Abuja. She wore a simple business suit and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned patience through suffering and strength through survival. Grace had no idea that her greatest victim was coming home. 10 years of planning, 10 years of building strength, and 10 years of gathering evidence. Zara is finally ready to face her killer. Can you imagine Grace's shock when she sees the woman she thought she murdered? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the confrontation in next chapter will be absolutely explosive. What do you think Zara's first move will be? The glass towers of Abuja's business district gleamed in the morning sun as Zara walked confidently through the marble lobby of Okoro Pharmaceuticals' headquarters. 10 years had transformed both the building and the woman entering it. Where once stood a modest pharmaceutical company focused on serving local communities, now rose a glittering corporate tower that spoke of international ambitions and enormous profits. The receptionist, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22, looked up with practiced politeness as Zara approached. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "I'm here to see Grace Adelique." Zara replied, using her stepmother's new married name. "I represent Sahel Pharmaceutical Consulting. We're interested in discussing a potential partnership. Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, already reaching for her phone to check the calendar. "Mrs. Adele Leek will want to see me," Zara said with quiet confidence. "Tell her that someone from her past would like to discuss the future of this company." 20 minutes later, Zara was escorted to the executive floor by a nervous assistant who had clearly been instructed to treat this unexpected visitor with unusual care. The elevator ride gave her time to study the changes Grace had made to her father's company. Gone were the modest furnishings and medical achievement awards that had once defined the executive offices. In their place stood expensive art, imported furniture, and photographs of Grace with various African heads of state and pharmaceutical industry leaders. The executive suite occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Abuja's skyline. Grace sat behind an enormous mahogany desk that could have seated a small board meeting, her back to the door as she spoke rapidly into a phone headset. At 51, she had aged well, maintaining the elegant appearance that helped her manipulate so many powerful men over the decades. "I don't care what the Ministry of Health says about our import licenses," Grace was saying into her headset. "We have contracts to fulfill and deadlines to meet. Find a way to expedite the approvals, or find someone else who can." She swiveled her chair around as Zara entered, clearly expecting to conclude her call quickly and dismiss another minor business associate. But when her eyes focused on her visitor's face, the phone headset slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the marble floor. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Grace's face cycled through expressions of shock, disbelief, and gradually dawning horror as she realized that the woman standing in her office was impossible, yet undeniably real. "Hello, Grace," Zara said calmly, settling into one of the leather chairs facing the desk. "You look well. Marriage to David Adelic seems to agree with you." Grace's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a hoarse whisper. "You're dead. I watched you fall. There's no way you could have survived that drop." "And yet here I am," Zara replied, crossing her legs and regarding her stepmother with the same calculating expression Grace had once used on her. 10 years older, considerably wiser, and very much alive. "The question is, how long will you remain so healthy yourself?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Grace's face went pale as she realized that the young woman she had tried to murder had returned with the patience and resources to potentially turn the tables. "What do you want?" Grace demanded, her voice gaining strength as she fought to regain control of the situation. "Money? I can transfer funds to any account you specify. A position in the company? I can create an executive role that would make you wealthy beyond your father's dreams. Just name your price." Zara smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about money or position. This is about justice, not just for me, but for all the people whose lives you destroyed in your pursuit of wealth." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on Grace's desk with deliberate ceremony. David Adelic's medical records make for interesting reading. Chronic fatigue, digestive issues, memory problems, and gradual organ dysfunction. The same progression of symptoms that killed your previous husbands, though you become more sophisticated in your methods over the years. Grace's composure cracked further as she realized the scope of Zara's investigation. "You have no proof of anything. Medical conditions are unpredictable, especially in men David's age who work in stressful industries." "You're right about needing proof," Zara agreed. "That's why I've spent 10 years gathering it systematically." She withdrew additional folders from her briefcase, spreading them across the desk like playing cards. "Bank records showing systematic asset transfers from your husband's accounts to overseas shell companies. Insurance policies purchased shortly before convenient deaths. Pharmaceutical supply records indicating your access to toxins that wouldn't show up in standard autopsy screenings." With each folder, Grace's face grew paler. When Zara produced photographs of David Adelic's deteriorating health alongside medical records from Grace's previous husbands, her stepmother finally understood the true scope of the evidence arrayed against her. "But my personal favorite," Zara continued, producing a final folder with theatrical flourish, is the security footage from a private investigator who's been documenting your daily routine for the past 6 months, including your weekly visits to a traditional medicine practitioner who specializes in compounds that cause gradual organ failure. Grace lunged for her phone, clearly intending to call security or possibly attempt to destroy the evidence. But Zara was faster, her hand closing over Grace's wrist with surprising strength. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Zara said quietly. "The moment you make that call, copies of all this evidence will be delivered to every major newspaper in Nigeria, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, and David Adelique's family lawyers. Your husband might be interested to learn why his health has been declining so mysteriously since your marriage." For the first time since Zara's arrival, Grace looked genuinely afraid. The woman who had spent decades manipulating and murdering wealthy men had finally encountered someone who understood her methods and had the resources to expose them. "What do you want?" Grace asked again, but this time her voice carried desperation rather than arrogance. Grace Adelique's final 24 hours of freedom began with frantic phone calls to lawyers, offshore bankers, and a traditional medicine practitioner who had been her partner in slow-motion murder. But Zara had anticipated every move, and each call revealed another dead end. Bank accounts had been frozen by court orders. International arrest warrants had been quietly issued. Even Grace's most trusted accomplices had mysteriously become unavailable. As dawn broke over Abuja, Grace made her last desperate play. She drove to her husband David's hospital room, where he lay unconscious from what doctors called acute organ failure of unknown origin. Her plan was simple: finish the job she had started, collect the life insurance, and disappear before the authorities could act on Zara's evidence. But when she entered the private room with a syringe concealed in her purse, she found Zara sitting calmly beside David's bed, reading a newspaper whose headline screamed, "Pharmaceutical heiress returns from dead to expose stepmother's murder plot." "You're too late," Zara said without looking up from the article. "David's family has been informed about your poisoning campaign. They've also been shown the evidence proving you killed your previous husbands the same way. His doctors have begun treatment to counteract the toxins you've been feeding him for months." Grace's hand tightened on the syringe hidden in her purse, but before she could move, 2 plainclothes police officers stepped out from behind the hospital room's curtains. Detective Sarah Ogundamu of the Nigeria Police Special Fraud Unit had been waiting for this moment since receiving Zara's evidence package at midnight. "Grace Adelique," Detective Ogundamu announced formally, "you are under arrest for the attempted murder of David Adelique, the murders of Chief Jonathan Okoro and Dr. Michael Adebayo, the attempted murder of Amaka Okoro, and multiple charges of financial fraud spanning 3 decades. As the handcuffs clicked around Grace's wrists, she turned to Zara with the same calculating expression that had defined their relationship for so many years. "You think you've won, but you've destroyed yourself in the process. 10 years living as a lie. 10 years without your real identity. Was your revenge worth throwing away your entire life?" Zara set down the newspaper and looked directly into Grace's eyes for what she knew would be the last time. "You're wrong about something fundamental. I didn't throw away my life. I found it. The privileged girl you tried to kill was weak and sheltered. The woman sitting here today has spent 10 years learning what really matters: community, purpose, and the strength that comes from surviving the worst that evil people can do." She stood and moved closer to Grace, her voice dropping to a whisper that only her stepmother could hear. "I've helped dozens of families avoid becoming your victims. I've built a business that provides jobs for hundreds of people. I've found love, friendship, and meaning in ways that pampered Amaka Okoro never could have. You didn't destroy my life. You forced me to build a better one." As Detective Ogundamu led Grace toward the door, the woman who had manipulated and murdered her way through decades of wealth turned back for one final exchange. "The police will never be able to prove the murders. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence has been destroyed. I'll be out in 5 years, and when I am, I'll find you." Zara's smile was serene and confident. "No, you won't. Because tomorrow, the families of your victims will be filing civil lawsuits that will claim every asset you've hidden in offshore accounts. The pharmaceutical companies you defrauded will be seeking criminal prosecution across multiple countries. And most importantly, David Adelik is going to recover and testify about exactly how you've been poisoning him. The truth of this prediction became clear over the following weeks as Grace's carefully constructed empire collapsed completely. International law enforcement agencies, armed with Zara's decade of evidence gathering, unraveled a criminal network that had operated across West Africa for over 20 years. Assets were frozen, accomplices were arrested, and victims' families finally received the justice they had been seeking for decades. David Adelik not only survived, but made a complete recovery once the poisoning stopped. His testimony, combined with Zara's evidence, provided prosecutors with an airtight case that resulted in Grace receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The woman who had killed for money would spend her remaining years in a concrete cell, finally unable to harm anyone else. But for Zara, the real victory wasn't Grace's imprisonment. It was what came afterward. Using her consulting business and the network of allies she had built over 10 years, she established the Okoro Foundation for Pharmaceutical Safety, dedicated to preventing the kind of corruption that had destroyed so many lives. The foundation's work was comprehensive and deeply personal. They provided free legal representation for families affected by pharmaceutical fraud, funded research into medication safety protocols, and worked with government agencies to strengthen oversight of drug imports and distribution. But perhaps most importantly, they created support networks for survivors of domestic violence and family betrayal, helping people rebuild their lives after experiencing the kind of trauma that had once broken Amaka Okoro completely. 6 months after Grace's conviction, Zara stood before the renovated headquarters of what was now called Okoro Musa Pharmaceuticals, named in honor of the fishing family that saved her life. Joseph and Sarah Musa stood beside her, officially recognized as the foster parents who had given her a second chance at life. The company had been transformed from Grace's corrupt empire back into the community-focused organization Chief Okoro had originally envisioned. Today we return this company to its original mission. Zara announced a gathered crowd of employees, community leaders, and journalists, not as a tool for enriching the few, but as a resource for healing and protecting the many. The ceremony was attended by David Adelik, who had become an unexpected ally in exposing pharmaceutical corruption, and by dozens of families whose lives had been destroyed by Grace's greed, but who now had hope for justice and recovery. Most meaningful to Zara was the presence of Dr. Kemi Adebayo, the young doctor who had once been positioned as her potential suitor, and who was now her partner in both business and life. Their relationship had developed naturally over the months of legal proceedings, built on shared values of integrity and service rather than the calculated arrangements Grace had once tried to impose. Kemi understood that Zara carried scars from her decade of exile, just as she understood that those same experiences had forged her into someone capable of extraordinary compassion and strength. As the sun set over Abuja that evening, Zara and Kemi walked along the banks of the Usuma River, discussing plans for expanding their pharmaceutical safety programs to other West African countries. The conversation was interrupted when Zara's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. The text was from Grace, somehow sent from a prison cell. "You may have won this battle, but I destroyed your childhood, your innocence, and 10 years of your life. How does victory taste when it costs you everything you could have been?" Zara showed the message to Kemi, who immediately offered to contact authorities about harassment from a convicted criminal. But Zara shook her head, typing a response that would be her final communication with the woman who had tried to destroy her. "You're wrong about what you destroyed and what you gave me," she wrote. "The girl you pushed from that cliff was sheltered, naive, and unprepared for the real world. The woman who survived the river has helped prevent dozens of other families from experiencing what mine did. I've found love that's based on choice rather than convenience, work that saves lives rather than destroying them, and peace that comes from knowing I've turned your evil into something good. Thank you for teaching me that the greatest revenge is building something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal." She deleted Grace's contact information after sending the message, closing that chapter of her life forever. 2 years later, Zara stood once again on the banks of a river. Not the rushing waters that had nearly killed her, but the gentle stream that flowed past the fishing village where Joseph and Sarah Musa had given her a new life. She was there for their golden wedding anniversary, surrounded by the extended family that had embraced her as their own daughter. As she watched the elderly couple dance to traditional music played by village musicians, Zara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. The pharmaceutical heiress who had fallen from sheer hills was gone forever, but in her place stood someone who understood the true value of family, community, and the strength that comes from surviving the worst that life can offer. Grace Adelique remained in prison, her appeals exhausted and her criminal network completely dismantled. But more importantly, the systems that had allowed her to operate with impunity for so long were being reformed by the very people she had tried to silence. The river that had nearly been Zara's grave had instead become her baptism into a life of purpose. And as she joined the celebration of love and family that surrounded her, she knew that the best revenge wasn't destroying your enemies. It was proving that their worst couldn't destroy your capacity for joy, love, and building something better from the pieces they left behind. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning the battle. It's discovering that you're stronger than you ever knew, and that even the deepest betrayals can become the foundation for deeper compassion. What an incredible journey from victim to victor. Did Zara's choice to turn pain into purpose inspire you as much as it inspired me? This story proves that sometimes our greatest enemies give us our greatest gifts, the strength to become who we were always meant to be. Drop a comment sharing what part of this story touched your heart the most. And if this tale of survival and transformation move you, smash that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories of triumph over adversity. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that no matter how dark the river, survivors can learn to swim. Until next time, keep believing in the power of rising stronger from every fall.